Do you wonder why we need a National Breastfeeding Month or a World Breastfeeding Week? Do you wonder why on your social media feeds you see various weeks celebrating various demographics like Indigenous Milk Medicine Week or Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Breastfeeding Week or Black Breastfeeding Week? And new this year, Semana de la Lactancia Latina. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about why I feel some nuance towards this month and why I tread lightly on social media during this month, why I don't consider myself a lactavist, and why I consider this month to be very important to promoting safety and health and support for parents and babies. So let's get into it. When I began breastfeeding, I was blindsided by how difficult it was. Having known only a handful of people who had ever done it and only seeing it up close a couple of times, I had a huge learning curve. Since then, I've become a doula, a childbirth educator, and an internationally board-certified lactation consultant, or an IBCLC. I'm your host, Lo Nigrosh, and I welcome you to the Milk Making Minutes, where we explore the systemic, medical, and cultural barriers that make feeding our babies so difficult, so that you know your baby feeding struggles are not your fault, and your triumphs really are the miracles you feel they are. This is the 13th year that we have had a National Breastfeeding Month. And it was founded by the United States Breastfeeding Committee. And the purpose of the United States Breastfeeding Committee is to promote conversation about policy and practice changes needed to build a landscape of support for babies and families. And the whole point of the Milk Making Minutes and of my practice as a lactation consultant is to highlight the systemic medical and cultural failures that make feeding our babies so difficult. And so we need a lot of policy changes. And so for me, this month is not about bragging about my breastfeeding experiences or showing off images of breastfeeding babies, but rather about highlighting all of the barriers that get in the way to feeding our babies human milk. We are mammals, yet for so long it has been hard for us to feed our babies milk from our bodies. And this has not always been the case. Just like when you look at a dog or a kitten or cows or goats, they really do not have difficulty feeding their babies when left alone to do. Out in the wild, bats are able to feed their babies. Kangaroos can feed their babies without difficulty. Whales feed their babies without difficulty. This is really not a struggle for other mammals. But in the industrialized human societies, it has become a struggle. And so the purpose of this month is to highlight those struggles. And so all families who have ever struggled to feed their babies human milk deserve to have policy changes so that their struggles become highlighted and so that people coming behind us don't struggle as much. And the kind of policy changes that we need in place are to have longer maternity leaves, to have less interference in the birth process, to have more people who can help support the feeding process and who are knowledgeable about how that feeding process happens, to have pediatricians either be more knowledgeable or who work with a team of people who are more knowledgeable, to have insurance companies who are not allowed to deny services for lactation care. The list could go on and on. It is unfair that so many people struggle. So this month is not about pitting people who have fed their babies human milk against people who struggled to do so or who chose not to do so because they saw how difficult it was to feed human milk to their babies, and so then chose a different path to eliminate this struggle from their lives because they wanted to have a parenthood in their baby's early infancy that was more free of stress. It's not about pitting these two camps against each other. It is about highlighting all of the barriers that get in the way of human milk feeding. And some of those barriers are the promotion of infant formula to the detriment of human milk feeding, because the regulation of the promotion of infant formula is lacking, as we saw during the formula crisis of the last couple of years. And the claims that formula companies are allowed to make are pretty outrageous. And the formula companies themselves have done a great job of partnering with politicians, with medical providers, to reduce rates of breastfeeding in order to increase their profits. So it is not the people using the formula that need to make any changes. It is the formula companies themselves and the regulators of those formula companies where we need to direct policy changes. And so that is the primary purpose of the National Breastfeeding Month. And I will have the United States Breastfeeding Committee's National Breastfeeding Month proclamation linked in the show notes so that you can read that and see what their mission is. Then we have, within the month of National Breastfeeding Month, we have these various weeks that celebrate various groups that are calling attention to advocacy within their demographic groups. And that was born from these groups saying we need to raise the rates of human milk feeding within our communities. We need to raise the types of support we get. We need to increase advocacy within our own communities, and it needs to come from the inside out. And so space was created for each of these groups to create advocacy for a week long to draw attention to the types of supports and advocacy that they felt they needed. And then as a lactation community, we rally around them to say, what do you need? What types of supports do you need? And then as lactation professionals, we listen to that. We learn from them. We attend seminars both in person and online, where we learn from leaders within those communities to hear what they are saying their community members need as we try to provide support. The first week is just World Breastfeeding Week, and this year it was enabling breastfeeding, making a difference for working parents. So thinking about how do we as lactation professionals and as communities, as people who rally around working parents, how do we support working parents to continue working and to feed human milk to their babies? So this can apply to anyone. If you are an employer, you should be thinking about this during the first week of August this year and moving forward. So what do your lactation rooms look like? What are your maternity leave policies like? What do your employees need from you to feel really supported when they come back to work while they are still trying to feed human milk to their babies? What would it look like for them to feel really settled once they come back to work and feel like, yes, I can fully engage in my work and still feel comfortable providing milk for my babies? And then how do we as lactation professionals help our clients to feel like they are fully prepared to head back into the workplace and still provide human milk for our human babies, which should be totally doable. And then week 2 is Indigenous Milk Medicine Week, and their theme is From the Stars to a Sustainable Future. And I love what they had to say about this. They said a sustainable future involves respecting and protecting all life givers, including the elements of earth, wind, fire, and water, in line with the teachings and foundations laid before us. Through breast and chest feeding, Indigenous people can promote health, community, environment, and cultural traditions that contribute to a sustainable future. And what I love about this is that people who give birth to babies are definitely life givers too. And people who feed human milk to their babies are literally giving life to their babies through that milk. And so having a time where we think about both protecting the earth, protecting the elements of the earth, and promoting human milk feeding is just so amazing. And a lot of the activities that were included in 2023 in Indigenous Milk Medicine Week included the intersections of lactation with environmental justice, reproductive justice, and the connection and protection of water, which of course is really important in the Indigenous community and should be important to all of us. So that is really beautiful. I have a really busy week coming up, and I thought, what better way to reduce my stress than to go onto feastandfettle.com and order meals for that week so I can just take one thing off of my plate by putting delicious meals onto my plate. See what I did there? So I went on to their website. It's really easy to use. I looked at all of the menu options for the week, and some of the things I'm excited about are some grilled steak tips with a delicious Thai peanut sauce and some green beans with a soy sesame sauce that's on the side. But there's so many other things. And that is one of the ways that I am choosing to provide self-care for myself so that I can reduce my stress load. If you would like to do the same and spend more time with your family and less time worrying about what's for dinner, go to feastandfettle.com to get home cooked meals delivered right to your front door. And you can get $30 off your first week's delivery by using my code MILK, MILK. And just let somebody else cook for you. You won't regret it. And then week 3 was Asian American, or is, because that's happening this week, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Breastfeeding Week. And the theme was telling our stories and elevating our voices. So making sure that these people feel like they are included in the conversations, that their traditions are included in the conversations when it comes to milk making. And we need to hear the stories from all sorts of traditions. And that's what I love about the Milk Making Minutes too, is that we get to hear the stories from people from all across the world. I've heard primarily stories from people from the United States, but we've heard stories from a first generation Mexican American. I've heard stories from Singapore. We've heard stories from a first generation Indian American. So we've heard stories from Australia. And so it's really important to hear stories from all over the place, because breastfeeding looks different in different communities. The fourth week is Black Breastfeeding Week. One of the founders of Black Breastfeeding Week is Kimberly Seals Allers, who is one of my favorite people on earth. I've gotten to attend continuing education conferences where she was a keynote speaker. She wrote the book, The Big Letdown, which you can purchase in my bookshop, and also support the Milk Making Minutes. The theme of Black Breastfeeding Week is We Outside, celebrating connection in our communities. And Kimberly Seals Allers, that's really what she's all about, is helping people create communities, going into communities and figuring out, what does this individual community need to increase health and rates of breastfeeding within that community. And I was going through and I was looking at what are the studies, because there are vast differences in the rates of initiation and continuing of breastfeeding between African Americans and white non-Hispanic Americans in the United States. And we have to take responsibility for this. We also know that in the United States, the African American infant mortality rate is 2.4 times the rate of non-Hispanic babies. When we look at the disparity, it spans across socioeconomic status. It's not just a matter of poor Black folk not feeding their babies. So we have to look at it from a lack of support from medical professionals, to a lack of role models, as Kimberly Seals Allers says, to the historical trauma that Black women being used as wet nurses faced during slavery. And also, Black women in slavery were forced to stop nursing their own children to provide breast milk for the children of the slave owner. They were literally pinned to the ground and had breast milk squeezed out of their breasts till there was nothing left to give to the babies of the slave owners. And so you can imagine that with that intergenerational trauma being passed down, that there would be a history of trauma that gets left over, that means that breastfeeding becomes less of this empowering experience and more of a tool used for exploitation. And formula then becomes more of a status symbol, which says, I don't need to do that. I can feed my baby formula because I have the funds and I have choice. And so it takes a lot more effort, and it has to come from within Black communities, which is why it's so amazing that these three Black women started Black Breastfeeding Week to celebrate feeding babies human milk from within their communities, and to figure out how to overcome this enforced trauma, the historical trauma, and figure out what it will take to improve breastfeeding rates and to provide the support needed to these communities so that these babies get the benefit of breast milk and breastfeeding just as much as other communities. It is important that we have weeks for communities that have historically been oppressed, that have historically been left out of the conversation so that they can be highlighted, so that we can hear from those voices specifically, and so that those of us whose communities have not been oppressed can sit back and listen and learn from them and hear what they need so that we can join forces and build a force together to increase the rates of human milk feeding for all of our babies. I mentioned at the top that I would talk about the term lactavist. And the reason I do not refer to myself as a lactavist is because I feel we need to have more nuance in the conversation around increasing the rates of human milk feeding to our babies. The Wikipedia page says lactavism is the doctrine or practice of vigorous action or involvement as a means of achieving a breastfeeding culture, sometimes by demonstrations, protests, etc., of breastfeeding. Supporters, referred to as lactavists, seek to protest the violation of International Code of Marketing of breast milk substitutes by formula companies and industry. When we use that term, we're not including everything that we know about how difficult it is to feed our babies human milk. And so therefore, we leave out the compassion needed in these conversations about all the people who wanted to feed their babies human milk but couldn't, or who chose not to because they heard so many horror stories from other people about how difficult it was, or who got bad advice from other people, or whose pediatricians led them astray, or who had such difficult birth experiences that their milk supply was impeded from the very beginning. I can go on. And so I find it a little bit problematic to have this term that implies a fighting stance towards other people when really what we are fighting are governmental policies and decision makers, and not other people who had to make difficult choices for the health of their family. Speaking of the health of your family, if you live in Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, or New Hampshire, and you would like to have lazy evenings where cooking was not on the agenda, then go to feastandfettle.com and use my code MILK, MILK, to get $30 off your first order of home-cooked meals delivered right to your front door. You're going to be very impressed by the menu options. I have loved being a customer, and I know you will too, so don't delay. Now, I would love to know, do you consider yourself a lactavist? Do you agree with what I am talking about or disagree? Have you seen anything on your social media feeds about the various weeks celebrating or trying to increase support in the various communities I have discussed? Have you been doing anything on your social media feeds to promote increasing support for human milk feeding? Join my Milk Making Minutes community group so that we can discuss it. And I want to ask you one more thing. For all of you who have been listening to the Milk Making Minutes, please do me a favor. And number one, hit the follow button. That really, really helps other people to find the show when you are following and it just downloads to your device automatically, because it increases my download numbers. That helps with the algorithms. And two, if you've been enjoying the show and you can give it a 5-star rating and a review. I don't ask this very often, but I'm going to ask it now. Please do that. It literally takes just a couple of minutes. Even if you're just able to write, love this show, it's helped me so much. That would go a long way into boosting my confidence and helping me know that you're out there. So could you please do that? Thanks. Have a great week. Bye.